Since the topic is going to be on representation of others, I wanted to state that I recognize my presence on the land of Tonga people, who are its rightful caretakers and whose connection to the land, water, and the culture I benefit from. I strive to understand my place within the structures of settler colonialism, and I'm aware that I have a responsibility to the native people and to their ancestors and descendants. This presentation is put together from my notes for curating the current exhibition Imprinting in Time at the Pacific Asia Museum and organizing public programs for the recent exhibition Kruyu Diary at the Hammer Museum. It is also inspired by the literature from the 90s of extraordinary thinkers on the subject. Both projects at PAM and the Hammer feature Chinese artists from the 80s to the early 2000s. I wanted to also express my gratitude to all the Chinese artists who gave me the blessing to complete the tests. Most of the works included in Imprinting in Time are from the gift by Charles Tongley, along with a few pieces from the museum's own collection and loans. The Hammer's exhibition featured works exclusively from the gift by Eloisa Haudenschild. Both collectors are white and based in the US. Ever since Trump was elected in 2008, the art world once again became the arena for identity politics and representation battles. Highly charged contents, emotional conversations, and traumatic memories are prevalent themes, putting race, gender, class, and representation front and center, which reminds me of multiculturalism from the 1980s to the early 2000s. Cornel West, in 1990, defines multiculturalism as a new cultural politics of difference. I find us stuck in the same conversations about identity construction or deconstruction, power relations, and how to generate multidimensional responses that articulate the complexity and diversity of the practices of people of color. Things have changed a bit for sure. For example, prior to Imprinting in Time, PAM hosted 2 exhibitions of works by Chinese artists. Both were curated by a white male curator. But in 2023, a diasporic person of color was invited to curate. But in general, things haven't changed much. I began my curatorial assignment by examining the history of USC Pacific Asia Museum, formerly known as the Curio Shop and home of Grace Nicholson, a dealer of Native American artifacts and later Asian antiques. She first invested a few $100s she had on Native American baskets. Her travel to the Western US and buying directly from the native weavers made her an expert in the field of anthropology. She was elected to the American Anthropological Association in 1904. Nicholson later shifted her focus to Chinese and Asian artifacts and took buying trips to Chinatowns in the US as the demand for Native American baskets slowed down. There is no evidence of her ever setting foot in Asia. She used Fu Manchu as an avatar for her treasure house of Oriental and Western art. Western here refers to the Western United States. Sex Rumor, who created a derogatory character of Fu Manchu, received recognition and honorary degrees at Harvard, which demonstrate how extensive has been the penetration of these views of Asians and Asian Americans into the American intelligentsia. During the COVID, at the height of the violence against Asian Americans and the Black Lives Matter movement, PAM announced decolonization of the museum. The measures include reviewing 15,000 objects in its collection, examining how they are classified, and asking if there are inherent biases in how they are described or categorized, studying provenance, as well as organizing a series of exhibitions and programs with the help of researchers, scholars, critics, community members, and artists to, quote, restore the voices, identities, and the stories rendered invisible by Orientalism, unquote. Meanwhile, the museum continues to glorify the biography of Nicholson. I wanted to ask, can decolonization have any meaning when the museum, knowing its problematic origin of settler colonialism, continues to eulogize the Orientalist architecture as well as Nicholson and her self-aggrandizing narratives, without first critically deconstructing the deep-seated colonial attitude of cultural hegemony? Everything else seems simply a posture for innocence. Nicholson's fetishism and her stereotyped novelty building naturally evoked the notion of a chinoiserie. Chinoiserie, a tentacle of Oriental fetishism, is a Western appropriation that mimics Chinese motifs and techniques. This term was first used by the French during the 18th century. The aesthetic of a chinoiserie in art, architecture, design, and fashion signals the fluid Western relations to the Chinese other, embodying paradoxes of desire and detest simultaneously. One of such products in the US is Chinatown. This architecture style emerged after the San Francisco earthquake in 1906 that wiped out the original Chinatown. The Chinese merchant elites worked with the white architects, took on a self-internalized Orientalist approach, appropriating traditional Chinese motifs, fabricating bright colors and fictional designs unfound in China to create an exotic chinoiserie image of Chinatown in San Francisco for arousing tourist fantasy. Soon, other cities began to replicate. Nicholson hired a Pasadena architectural firm to translate her chinoiserie fantasy into a, quote, beautiful and impeccably researched building. Her illustrations were incorporated into a design which carefully followed the Imperial Palace courtyard style used in the construction of major buildings in Beijing. Nicholson made sure every detail was correct, following plans and photographs of authentic Chinese examples. The arched entrance is an exact copy of the Buddhist library in Beijing, unquote, according to the museum's eulogy. How did she obtain, has the museum fact-checked any of those claims? What kind of research did she conduct? How did she obtain the ideas of the Imperial Palace courtyard style, aside from perhaps seeing a few pictures? And which Buddhist library in Beijing? For the museum to acclaim the Grace Nicholson building as, quote, one of the great treasures of the museum, being an important and extraordinary example of Chinese architecture in the US, unquote, is utterly irresponsible. This building is, at best, an example of exoticized Chinatown architecture that caters to tourist fantasy. The distorted Chinatown architecture is as bizarre as Frankenstein in the eyes of Chinese and Chinese Americans. To be fair, Pam's building isn't the worst, but the point is that this culture institution fails to exercise due diligence in critical self-reflection of its thorny past, which should be the first step of decolonization. It is a great mistake to describe Nicholson's treasure house and the Chinatown architecture as Asian heritage and memorialize them because they don't embody values Asian and API communities wish to honor. Leaders in academic, culture, and the political communities should help deflect instead of encourage any tendency to the exotic nostalgia and the delusion. Nicholson's house is valuable as a stark evidence of California's history of settler colonialism and Orientalism. Although the museum admits its Orientalist gaze, it continues to support this gaze by applauding its deeply problematic origin and its chinoiserie architecture. To make matters worse, it continues to validate white collectors who look at China as the politically primitive and culturally exotic other. The gifted works to both Pan and the Hammer were made by Chinese artists, sold by Westerner-owned commercial galleries in China to the Western collectors at the height of global multiculturalism propelled by the West. I wanted to briefly revisit that period of time. 1989 witnessed the crash of democratic movements in China, the lift of the Iron Curtain on the East Bloc, the first democratic election in Brazil after the dictatorship, the beginning of the Afghan Civil War, and the birth of Internet. Many new economic frontiers in the global South and the Third World were on the horizons. 2008 signaled the emergence of China as a new economic and geopolitical powerhouse with the opening of Beijing Olympics, as well as the intermission of multiculturalism in the US following the election of Barack Obama. Since 2008, Chinese collectors have played a significant role in the art market, both domestic and overseas. Today, the young generation of artists depend mostly on Chinese collectors for support. Between the two bookend years of 1989 and 2008, multiculturalism was widespread in the West. However, the identity conversation was not evident in Chinese artists' works, even until today. Instead, they were preoccupied with individuality, existential inquiry, economic aspiration, Western pop culture, and sexual anxiety. How did China fit in the constellation of multiculturalism? What attracted collectors and institutions from the Western societies to art made in China? Art historian David Carrier's analysis rings a bell. He argues, quote, as capitalism seeks new markets, leaving no part of the world unexplored, so Western art history now looks to all cultures, interpreting exotic art in ways guided by its own precepts. The 1990s saw China's rapid transformation into a hybrid consumer society. Commercial galleries emerged in China for the first time, but almost all of them were owned by Westerners in this early stage. The overarching goal for Chinese artists was to become international or global. What did it mean to become international or global? In my interview for the Hammer Project with the two artists, Xu Yong and Yang Zhenzhong, who have been active since the very early 1990s, they recall Chinese artists' efforts of seeking out acceptance and approval of Western audiences at the time. They admit that to them, the notion of globalization at the time was to be accepted and approved by the West and Japan, not Africa, not India, not Mexico. One strategy was to obliterate the difference, for instance, using English in their works, even though no Chinese artists read English themselves. Another strategy was to ghettoize the difference and to hyperbolize Chineseness. I want to quickly address these two images. So on the left is the work by Shang. He did this entire project through internet, asking the audiences in the US and also UK to input how would be a posh image for Chinese. So this is the image he eventually put together is according to all the recommendations from the US and UK and other part of the Western Europe. And to the right is very self-explanatory. It's a painting that exoticizes Chinese. This diagram illustrated the asymmetrical structures of power in the 80s, 90s, and early 2000s, when Chinese artists' work and practice were subject to the Western gaze and to the Western authority for inclusion, interpretation, and representation. During those times, Chinese artists could only enter the Western discourse by either selling to the West or being invited to participate in exhibitions. A few noteworthy exhibitions at the time were Magicians of the Earth, 1989 in France, the Venice Biennale, 1993 in Italy, Another Long March, 1997 in the Netherlands. Let's unpack one case in point, Magicians of the Earth. Labeled in the West as one of the first events of global art that no longer follows a master narrative and contradicts modernity's claim to offer a universal model. However, non-Western artists and scholars are more skeptical. Many have expressed their frustration of entering the Western multiculturalism entangled by the alienating structures of Eurocentrism. Artist Rashid Arian's critique of his own participation in the show and the Western curatorial strategies in general is on point. The curator, Jean Huber Martin, selected over 100 Western and non-Western artists, including 3 Chinese artists, in an attempt to grapple with, quote, relationship of our culture to other cultures of the world, unquote, underpinned by the mystifying idea of magic, which rendered Arian's position as contemporary artist invisible. The recognition of a power imbalance is necessary to unveil the hegemonic center that possesses the authority to rewrite and reproduce dominant narratives. Arian, in his critical essay, begins with a personal positioning, declaring himself as a subject of British imperialism and a Pakistani artist whose native languages are Punjabi and Urdu. In his view, as participant, the show neither overturned nor negated the centered periphery model of the self-serving interest in exhibition making of the West. Thus, the work of the other and the third world cultures were exploited to reinforce Western modernist philosophical traditions, upholding its universalist imperatives. Puerto Rican curator Mary Carmen Ramirez, in her essay, Broken Identities, Art Curators and Politics of Cultural Representation, further explains how marginalized identities are commodified and marketed upon the notion of cultural differences and desired others for multiculturalism at the moment, when modernism that emphasized universality and a cultural hegemony was losing ground. In the same year of 1989, of after 10 years of pleading and insisting, Ariane finally was given the chance to curate the exhibition, The Other Story, at London's Hayward Gallery, showing Afro-Asian artists in post-war Britain. Unlike Martin, the white curator whose desire to integrate non-Western artists into Western discourse was granted with immediate institutional support and highly regarded by the press, Ariane, an artist of color, was met with institutional resistance for 8 years and unfairly scrutinized by the Western media. How did the notion of universality in the cultural hegemony begin? In the lecture on the philosophy of world history, Hegel advanced the famous definition of world history as the, quote, record of the spirit's consciousness of its own freedom, unquote, that results in a hierarchy of civilizations. Each civilization represents a particular state of development. According to him, only the Christian Western European world has realized the highest civilization. He famously exempted Africa as an unhistorical continent and stated that Chinese and Indian civilizations were fixed and undeveloped, which doesn't deserve a spot in world history. Native peoples in the Americas he described as culturally inferior. Hegelian enlightenment has a profound impact on Western perspective and attitude towards Asia, Africa, and Latin America. Thus, Hegel's philosophy of world history conveniently provided for the incorporation of the lower manifestations of the spirit into its higher expression of Christian Europe, paving the road for the civilizing mission of European colonial project, and to an extent, the campaign for diversity that exploits the uncharted markets. On the left of the screen is Adam's map of history in 1871, illustrating the Hegelian notion of the world. According to this map, the black areas are continents without history, without civilizations. And on the right is an example of the Benetton campaigns in the 90s that commodified racial, social, and geopolitical issues, which through the transformation into commodities lost their significance as problematic human conditions, and the brand became a universal symbol of multiculturalism. Now, I wanted to circle back to issues in the museum representation of others. Every time we go to a museum, we all should ask the questions such as, what do we see and not see in a museum? On what terms? And by whose authority? Who or what defines the identity of the museum? Charles Townley was a professor of library science at New Mexico State University with a modest disposable income. He received a grant from Fulbright in the 90s to lecture in China periodically, where he became acquainted with Brian Wallace and Lawrence Hedling, two wine dealers in Beijing and Shanghai, who sold him affordable works. Townley admits that he had neither knowledge of nor experience in both art and art market. He solely relied on his own instinct and these two wine dealers' recommendations, which explained the overall underwhelming quality of the collection of paintings, prints, and other objects. The Haudenschild family, who donated their videos and photographs, donated their video and photography collection to the Hammer Museum, operated differently. They were seasoned collectors, lived in China, regularly interacted with Chinese artists, and assisted a few artists with their projects, which helped the Haudenschiilds comprehend the artistic landscape in China and select important works at the time. I believe anybody should be able to buy whatever makes their heart content and from whoever they want. However, I'm puzzled by the motive of the museum to accept Townley's entire hodgepodge collection into its already overstuffed collection and deplete its already strapped resource. What exactly accomplished for the museum by accepting the donation? What is the decision process for accepting the gift? With the institutional approval and the reward of an exhibition honoring the collector, the museum seems to me foregoing its social, scholarly, and educational responsibilities and continuing with the legacy of Nicholson's Oriental Curio Shop. A more personal and troubling question for me is, what role did I play in the museum's performance of corrective inclusion under the banner of dismantling Orientalism? A museum has the responsibility to its viewers and society, which requires, first of all, an acknowledgement of the meaning-making potential of the institution, from acquisition to interpretation to hiring employees to application of its cultural authority and social agency. A museum is a value-making machine for its artists, donors, employees, and its real estate. With its institutional power, a museum in the 21st century has the social responsibility to challenge the dominant West-centric narratives and the power relations inherited from the colonial era. Anna Iwataki, an Asian American and a PhD candidate at USC, published an article last year about her agonizing visit at Penn. Her critiques on the architecture, the institutional culture, the curatorial decisions, the viewing experience, and museum's PR campaign are on point. Many AAPI peers share her concerns and frustration. I invite everyone to read it. The link is on the screen. The mechanism of acquiring, exhibiting, interpreting, and representing Chinese art from the 80s to the early 2000s reveals the otherness of a non-European trajectory in art development that strives to coexist with Western art history. Can non-Western artists find an equal space in the master narrative of a unified Western art history with universal claims that are constructed by Western institutions, academics, and historians? Or are they merely specimens for exploration, in which any white man or Western institution who plays the role of Marco Polo is met with rewards for his ethnographic discovery and anthropological voyeurism? A singular figure of prominence is Wu Li-sik, a former Swiss ambassador and businessman to China. Hong Kong's mega museum, M+, has received a major gift of 1,463 works from his Chinese contemporary holdings. Sik's donation is valued at $163 million, while the museum will purchase another 47 works for $23 million. Since the 1970s, a wealthy and powerful person, he has not only taken advantage of his diplomatic and entrepreneurial positions in China, buying art with deeply discounted prices from nearly all artists, but also propelled careers in the West for some Chinese artists. Many artists at the time thought he was God sent. A trip to his castle in Switzerland at the Basel Art Fair was considered an ultimate pilgrimage. No other movers and shakers are nearly as influential as Sik when it comes to contemporary art in China. Quite a few works in his collection carry significant historical and aesthetic values. The success of Zeke's collection is the result of his massive wealth, the unthinkable volume of his purchase, his fluency in Chinese language, his experience in collecting, his constant interaction with the Chinese artists, his business savvy, and his vast global network in the art world. He was in the right place at the right time. After 2008, as one Chinese artist remarked last week, the halo of Wooly Zeke and other Marco Polos who once looked at art in China through the ideological and transactional lenses disappeared because the new generation of Chinese artists understand the reality and no longer regard white collectors as saviors. China once existed for the Western historians and explorers as objects of inquiry within well-defined geographic domains. Now people like me, a person in diaspora who identifies as both Chinese and Chinese American, live and work in the West. Our presence as cultural theorists, Rachel argues, disrupts the production of both illusion and knowledge about China. I have been constantly asked if I'm an expert of Chinese art. I'm sure many Black and Latinx curators are equally annoyed by the similar question, as if we, intellectuals of color, are only possible to represent nations and cultures of others. Only until recently, white curators were the gatekeepers of any art made in any region by any artist of any origin. Today, most curators of Asian descent are assigned to interpret Asian or Asian diasporic artists. In other words, I'm still beheld as the other, and on the margin where artists and intellectuals of color are confined. This is a problematic attitude stemming from the construction of minority discourse to contrast the hegemonic discourse of the West, whose notion of humanity is regarded as prototype. Everything else must be ghettoized. Minority discourse is, quote, the product of damage more or less systematically inflicted on cultures produced as minorities by the dominant culture, unquote. When it comes to art from non-Western regions, such as China, readings are always limited to either the artist's biography or the ideological context. The first stretched introduction text by the white curator for the Hammer Museum's Cruel Youth Diary that painted a fallacious picture of artists as oppressed victims and political dissidents completely missed the fact that the 90s was the most liberal moment for creativity in China, and the artists there had the best time. One Chinese artist, I shall not utter his name, whose family's position in the Chinese authoritarian government shelters him from harsh punishment, understand the rule of the game. He effectively displays his investment in exposing social injustice and suffering in China, which aligns with the ideological agenda of the West. He's now the most celebrated Chinese artist in the West. Ironically, nobody talks about what his art is, but what his art is about. This self-aggrandizing representative of the voiceless and the suppressed conveniently capitalizes in the West at the very expense of the voiceless and the suppressed in China, further legitimating cultural regimes of the hegemonic power, meanwhile ghettoizing his own people. Consciously knowing that I can't represent Chinese artists in China, I wonder what my position is here. My strategy for organizing the exhibition at the PAN was to try my best to open up a historical perspective to resist the gaze of the West. But let's be real, to whom did I present this exhibition? What can I say as a guest with extremely limited access to finding, material, culture capital, institutional support, and resources? Are I and the exhibition the token of a museum's decolonization posture? Do I willingly contribute to the museum's PR campaign for innocence that glosses over its deeply problematic past and skips the real hard questions? I'm feeling conflicted and confused and angry. I'm sincerely grateful to be invited into a privileged space of representation, but my access to that privileged space is regulated by the power structure to which I don't belong. I can't help but notice people holding the gatekeeping positions at the Pacific Asian Museum are all white, but security guards, receptionists, low-level employees, and contracted workers like me are mostly people of color. This inequality speaks louder to me than their words. As Awataki wrote in her essay about Penn, quote, "It's too simplistic to attribute the limits of museums' practice to its categorization as an institution that deals with objects rather than living artists," unquote. I should add employees and contracted culture workers here too. The clever strategies of offering artists and culture workers of color the opportunity to fix the most contentious and complex problems without much financial and institutional support burden us with the most unpleasant responsibilities, while we, as powerless guests, must not only navigate the whims and the regulations of our white hosts and put up a front of an individual agency, but also swallow the insult of the museum cheerleading its Orientalist and colonial past. Working on both projects at Penn and the Hammer afforded me the opportunity to examine the current effort to globalize art history, the discourse of cultural theory, and the debates on identity. Here, I wanted to bring forth art historian Covina Mercer's notion of the burden of representation, which is the risk of being perceived as speaking for the totality of, in this case, the Asian experience, the third world experience, and the Asian American experience. However, I and I alone cannot be appointed person to speak on behalf of Chinese artists just because my physical appearance. For one, my race doesn't have anything to do with my intellectual interest. For two, the community of Chinese artists isn't a homogeneous and fixed entity defined by their nationality and their non-Westernness. As Mercer pointed out, when artists and curators are positioned on the institutional margins of cultural production, we're burdened with the impossible task of speaking as representatives of the marginalized communities from which we come. We have a chip on our shoulders. Therefore, we have the sense of urgency to say it all at once, because we might only get one chance to say it at all. Our access to the public space for voicing our opinions is rationed by the effects of racism and market hypes. As a result, in our voice about artists of color and non-Western artists, there's often no criticism, no conversations about aesthetics. There's no space for agreement or disagreement except for making value judgments that are either moral or monetary. We also risk displacing questions of structure by shifting our focus to the token of individual agency. Constantly unraveling preconceived notions about my identity as an immigrant of color in the Western art world, I'm very much aware of my own duality. In the current market-driven, politically correct, and identity-sensitive climate, I wanted to ask, is it even possible to produce critical curatorial work? However, we must try. My strategies for not categorize artists of color and non-Western artists as others in the minority discourse and avoid ethnographic voyeurism are basically the following. 1, to take a deep dive into the details of artists' work instead of making ideological, ethnic, and cultural differences the priority in evaluating art. 2, to pull art historical references from all regions and periods across the board to resist the notion of universality that is highly selective. 3, to read literature by non-Western thinkers. I wanted to end my presentation with 3 questions on the screen. How should the decolonization of a museum in the West look like? How should the museum in the West represent diverse identities and cultures? What changes do you hope to see? Thank you for putting up with my catharsis, and I wanted to give a special thank you to my brothers and sisters who braved the traffic to be here.